And it seems like, if I recall your answer, well, perhaps you want to just restate your position on that.
Yeah, I do think you can be sexist towards men. I think I kind of compared it to our discussion of race, and I said I think it's a bit different from race, but I do think that you can be sexist towards men. But as you would agree, you can't really exert any kind of real force over men. So what's the, what's the outcome?
Why would force be the requirement for sexism? Sexism would just
no.
be
I'm saying you can be sexism, but I'm saying you're not really going to be able to. Nothing will really come of it. I mean, if men have the power and that's how it should be,
it doesn't mean that. So just so you understand, and I see people always conflate this argument. In fact, the super chatter did, because everything will eventually reduce to force. Does not mean that society always operates inside of the mode of force. It will just always end up going back to force. Always, inevitably. So you can have brainwashed societies, which we have right now, and you can have people who operate inside of these delusions and operate as though there is power where there is no power. In fact, some of the most powerful people on planet Earth are able to manipulate people into thinking they have all sorts of power, which they do not actually have. This is part of a game of psychological manipulation, but that does not mean that you cannot oppress men and their sexuality, nor that you can even the patriarchy itself.
So what's your definition of oppression for men? Since we were kind of going back and forth on the definition.
I'll just utilize yours.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, there's no doubt that men can oppress men, and there's no doubt that women can use the levers of power to also be oppressive towards men for their own aims. That can happen.
Okay. So I mean, that makes it sound like maybe feminism isn't so futile then. If we're capable of if we're capable of oppressing men, then how would we not also be capable of kind of reclaiming that kind of power for ourselves, for our own aims?
When you're talking about oppression, you're talking about pushing back against a specific group. This does not mean that ultimately you have the monopoly on force. Men do. But so think of it this way. You're inside of a prison, okay? And there's 2 guards and there's 100 inmates. The 2 guards can keep the 100 inmates under control, right? But if the inmates collectively go, what happens to the guards?
They will die.
Yeah. So it's the illusion of safety, and there's an illusion of systems, but they eventually always break down. But that does not mean while we don't collectively live inside of these socially constructed delusions, which sexism would be one, and a race would be another, right? Socially constructed delusion that people cannot be oppressed inside of them, because oppression's a socially constructed delusion too, right?
So the oppression of men is a socially constructed delusion.
As much as it is for women.
Okay, well then...
So then if we agree on that, then men can't be sexist towards women ever.
But I mean, but I'm coming from the perspective that we are living and operating in this system. Like, regardless of whether or not you think it's a delusion, this is how the world is operating. People are affected by it. I think we kind of talked about that on the panel, that just because something doesn't necessarily translate to like a physical objective reality doesn't mean we aren't all experiencing it.
Sure. So, you can have people who get their hearts cut out on a temple and their bodies kicked down because it gets sacrificed to God, or their God, and that's a effect. You could say this is an effect of your worship of this demonic deity, which does not exist, right? Yeah. So sure. I agree with that, but it just doesn't negate my point at all.
Well, I'm not sure why it's valid to talk about the oppression of men under this delusional system, but we can't also talk about the way women are negatively affected by it.
We can talk about, and women they used to talk about the issues that they had all the time from the moral high ground when they weren't being utilized as political tools.
So do men have the moral high ground now?
As political men, ultimately there will be a select few men who will end up with a moral high ground through the church, things like this. But generally speaking, inside of society, politicians almost never have the moral high ground.
So, I mean, if they don't have the moral high ground, on average, why should they be able to talk about their issues? I mean, why, I guess...
Because they have the monopoly on force.
Okay,
and all of your subjective morality is going to reduce to force. That's why. And so they can enforce whatever the hell they want, and might makes right if you're a subjectivist. What else does it make?
I mean, that doesn't sound like men are very oppressed. Then it doesn't really sound like men are facing a real harsh
Now,
reality.
saying
then.
that there could be the men who are in the levers of power who don't have great moral claims but can utilize force doesn't mean that you can't have men who are oppressed in society, even if it's by other men. But it can certainly be done by women as well who have their hands on the levers of power due to a shared delusion.
So why can't those women who have their hands on the levers of power use it for women's aims, like feminism?
They do. And what we end up with is antinatalism and all sorts of nonsense, which is why it's going to reduce back to a power centralization where men eventually
But
collectively
I mean, that's a
eliminate
prediction.
women's rights.
You can't prove that's actually going to happen.
I can. Well, I can't prove for sure, but I can show you historically what the standard has been this, is that always what ends up happening is the force doctrine gets reintroduced and rights collectively are taken away from women. It's not that this is something I advocate be done. I'm just telling you that that's what's going to happen.
Okay. Yeah.
That's it's an eventuality which basically is inescapable.
Okay. Take your word for it.
Well, since this was sort of a two-pronged thing and it stemmed from the conversation that we had the other day about race, we could perhaps delve into that briefly. So can you be racist towards white people?
I still say no. No.
Can't be racist towards white people.
No.
Okay.
You can be prejudiced against white people on like an individual basis.
Why don't we do definitions then? So how do you define racism?
I would say that racism is prejudice is part of it, but you have to be in a position of power.
Prejudice plus power.
Sure. That's kind of like a nice like sociology.
I reject your definition.
What's
Okay.
yours, Andrew?
I don't need to give a counter definition. I just reject yours. Why am I wrong?
I don't know. I mean,
You don't know why I'm wrong to reject that definition? Why I
well,
should
you haven't
accept
explained
it?
why you reject it.
Why do I need to even give an explanation?
Wait, is this Hitchens' razor?
We're not going to get very far then. I don't know.
Well, it's not Hitchens' razor. It's just to point out that from your subjective, if everything inside of your worldview is subjective, then you saying the definition that I use is prejudice plus power, why shouldn't I just reject that definition as being something I don't accept as being true?
Okay, but then I mean, how can we say that any definition of racism is objective?
Well, you couldn't.
Okay, then I mean, like, why even bother discussing it then? I don't.
Good question. It was the one I was asking you the other night, which is you seem to think that race is a social construction, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So
do you
if
disagree?
race is a social construction and all of your definitions of it are subjective, including the oppression being subjective, why even talk about it? Wouldn't that eliminate racism?
Because okay, you are arguing that this is all like a delusional construction, but male oppression is still real because they're still living it, right? Even though it's all a delusional construction. So race is a delusional
No.
construction.
The power mechanisms are a delusional construction, not the effect. We've already agreed that the effect
That's my
can be
exact
true.
point. The effects are real.
Yeah, I understand, but that still doesn't tell me why I should accept that definition as being true.
Well, that's not what we were talking about. You were asking me then if race is a social construct, if we all just agree it doesn't exist, how can there be...
Yeah, but the effect is only real if you accept the construct as being true.
That's not true.
It
Because,
is true.
No, there are objective effects of racism, of historical
Because you
oppression.
accept it as being true.
No, I mean, if you tomorrow say that race doesn't exist, race isn't real, that's not going to change the fact that...
No. But if everybody acted as though it wasn't, then it would change the effect.
It wouldn't move people out of neighborhoods that have been historically redlined.
Why? There wouldn't be any more redlining because there wouldn't be any construction called race anymore.
But those neighborhoods would still be worse places
yeah, but
to
those
live.
people would eventually move off of those neighborhoods and there would be no restrictions because nobody cared about race, right? That's
I
the
mean,
whole
sure,
point.
in that world where suddenly everyone wakes up and doesn't care about race, I guess, and yeah, in like 10 to 20 years, people could move out of their
then
redlined
the
neighborhoods.
point is for the social construction of race and for oppression, then the best thing in the world to do would be for people to just not even follow the construction, right?
But
And
that's
then
not
if
gonna-
that's eliminated, nobody believes in race anymore. None of them are racist.
That's not going to happen. I mean, the best thing for male
It's
oppression
not
would
going
be...
to happen, right?
Okay, well, the best thing for male oppression would be to just wake up and
take all the rights away from women.
Yeah, and that's not gonna
right, exactly.
Exactly.
But that's the inevitability.
but
that's
that's
my
not
point.
gonna. But you're saying that's not gonna happen.
No,
So-
I'm saying it. I've literally said over and over again, it's an inevitability that it happens.
Okay, but you think that's happening soon? You think that men are gonna wake up and take all the rights away from women?
I think that as you see the polarization happening and you start to see things like the repeal of the 19th moving forward, you start to see more and more conservative politicians pushing back against this idea that suffrage itself is a great idea, I think that the voting pool will eventually get limited, and I think I'll see it within my lifetime. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, then why doesn't the case of race, ignoring it is going to be the best
Well, I'm
possible
not even
thing?
saying that it is. I'm just asking you why I should accept that racism itself can only be prejudice plus power rather than just a personal treatment of a person.
Because we don't see the same effects on white people.
But even if we don't see the same effects, that doesn't mean that I need to assume that that's racism.
Okay, so I mean, if we want to agree to a different definition wherein you can be racist against white people, then I guess my question is, why would it matter?
Why would what matter? Being racist
Race-
against white people?
Yeah, if there's no effects, if
Because
it's not...
they don't like it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the same reason that you don't want us to be racist to black people, right? Because they
No,
don't
because
like
there
it.
are actual material effects that
That they
have
don't like.
disprivileged...
That they don't like.
Sure, okay.
Yeah.
Why keep women in the home? They don't like it. Some of them don't
Yeah,
like
but
it.
they do like it. So
Some of them don't. You can
yeah,
ask them.
but those they've never been restricted to only being in the home. That's never happened. That's delusional think.
Okay, but
Never.
I'm
It's
just
never
I'm
happened.
just saying, yes, sometimes people just not liking something is enough of a reason, I guess, to
Yeah,
take it
so then that would
seriously.
be racism to white people. If you're doing something to them that they don't like, right?
Yeah, sure, they would not
based on
like
their
it.
race, that's racism.
Okay, yeah. If we're going on that definition where you can be racist against